Hello again, it's Desmond Aubrey from RareTechSEA or Rarefied Technologies Southeast Asia. So let's continue. This is now part 2 of the introduction to RTCalc Lite, but the academic version. And in the last part we spoke here about using the batch function, but going into the standard examples that I've provided you. There's something like 284 different examples here that you can work with, alright? So but they're nice kickstart examples and quick start examples. You don't have to go into a blank screen and get a bit scared. Now what do I have to put in, what don't I? The learning curve now is cut down for you quite quickly. So let's go on to, which is quite logically another utility that you're working on. Sorry, I'm just jumping a little bit. I think it's my computer, and because I'm using the screen part, it's also running a bit slow. It's not normally so slow. Okay. And if you look here at this one for pressure drop, what is it? Let's just take you through. It's going to launch the pressure drop screen for you, and you go in and you click parameters. Okay, hopefully. Alright, and it'll launch you into the pressure drop screen. It's not normally this slow. I think it's because I'm running the screen recorder. And in this case, what are we sitting with? It's trying to understand the pressure drops if you've got a certain plate. So you can go through, there's a list of different plates that you can play with here. And you can actually, there's, alright, fine, they're all going to be H-type channels that I've stuck in here typically. Just, you can ignore this one for now. And then the number of passes that are going through the unit, sometimes you have multi-passes, the number of channels that you may have in parallel, but you work for one now if you're wanting to understand what's happening in compared channels. And you've got a reference temperature of say 40, and the fluid that you want to work with, water. You have a very large library that you can work with of different fluids if you want to. All kinds of fluids in here. And if you see an AL next to it, that's an alpha Laval reference, where I've put in the alpha Laval reference fluids. So if you're trying to do a comparison to alpha Laval designs, you could use those. It'll give you the same comparator. But when you see RTC, these are the RareTech equivalents as well. Sometimes there's slight variations. You've got to be careful. One manufacturer will use this fluid parameter, or property should I say, and the other one will use something else. So if you're trying to do a true let's call it back-to-back comparison, you should be careful on what fluid you use. So given all these parameters, you go ahead and what are you going to find? You can actually calculate at certain pressure drops what flow rate it'll actually allow through the plates. Okay, through that channel. And in this case we've said, okay, give me one channel. It's easy to understand for comparison purposes. And so you might then go along and say, okay, at a pressure drop of 1, I've got a flow rate of this. Or you could actually put flow rate on the x-axis, and the y-axis you then put pressure drop. It also allows you to dump it to an Excel report, but not for this version. For the professional version, you can dump it to an Excel report. Okay, to make it life easier, for you can actually plot all this. And then you can actually, once you've done the calculation, you can actually dump it to a report, and you're sitting here with all the information that you need, all the channel type, the number of passes, number of channels, fluid name that you've got, the reference temperature. Of course, properties change with temperature, and it then goes through and does the calculations, and then you can dump that by hand if you want to, or just scan it. You can do a PDF scanner, dump it down into your own spreadsheet or whatever you want to process with. Okay, so that's again the reporting function of it. And you can play. I mean, you might decide, all right, how does that channel compare if I now stick whole milk through? You actually, just out of interest, we did water there, and sometimes you'll see if my water is slightly different. We'll see if the properties change. That water turns out to be the same. Sometimes it's not, and then you've got to be careful. Okay, if you now take whole milk, let's say 13% milk and the rest is water, and you have a look at it, what happens now to the values? They change. Alright, so each fluid will give you a different response. So, you might put wine in here and say, okay, what does it do? Most people drink wine rather than actually putting it through. Anyway, so it'll change the property. So you need to understand how these channels work if you want to get to that level of detail. And then, of course, as you change the plates, now, just talking through what we mean when we talk about H, M, and L. An H plate has, they typically call it a hard plate. We've got a very large included angle between the chevron parts, of the two parts of the chevron, okay? A very large angle. And these generate very good heat transfer, a lot of turbulent moving things around, but they have a high pressure drop associated with that. Then the other type of plate is your L plate, where we have a much smaller included angle between the arms of the chevron. And of course, in this case, the heat transfer coefficients are a bit lower. The heat transfer it's not as good. The pressure drops, of course, are much lower. Then what has become an industry standard is what they typically call alpha flex or thermal mixing. What you do is you take an H plate and an L plate and you turn them around and you put them together, and you then form what they call an M plate. So we have basically an included angle that's the average of the H and the L. This is what they call the thermoflex model. Alpha flex model. And that's their style of doing things. So you can actually get 3 types of channel out of only having 2 types of plates. See, in the beginning, when they first made these, they actually made M plates. And then they discovered, oh my goodness, waste of money, because the pressing for the M plate it's quite expensive. So, for each press tool, it's a lot of money. You don't need it. You just put them back to back and off you go. But the guy who has to build the exchanger has to be careful. They're quite tricky, all right. You have to be careful. And then just talking a little bit more through here. These, where I've got a dash here, okay, there's 2 types of plates families in the library that I have here. The one set is based, let's call it on industry norms. So some of the packages, the more up-end packages out there, you'll find if you go through the databases, they have some common size, plate sizes that they've kind of shared amongst each other somehow. And this is what these are the, let's call it the conventional, or the conventional standardized type plate. But in reality, if you go to the actual people who actually, the aftermarket, who actually make most of the plates today, they find slightly different values to these values here. And funnily enough, some of these values also are idealized values by the OEM manufacturers. But in reality, over the years, the sizes are a little bit different. And some of the manufacturers might have different pressing depths, for instance, or slight changes in chevron angle. Chevron pitch also changes slightly. So in reality, these give slightly different responses. And you can play with that and have a look and see what the responses look like by adjusting. Now, I can also provide for the academic projects, I can also provide a lot of this detail to you on the different sizing. So you can then look and say, oh, okay, that's what affected that. And okay, you can then do projects where you actually experiment and you do parametric studies to see what's going on. Okay, and again, so typically you'll have the one family here, okay, and then you'll have the other family there, which is the actual measured values. All right, I'll call these first ones consensus. That's a fancy term I used. Consensus plates. Everybody's kind of agreed that's what the plates are, but in reality, they're not actually like it. When you actually look at what's coming out of the field, they're slightly different. Let me tell you how they do it. What happens is a lot of your aftermarket people, they actually get these plates and they measure them. They buy them, from the OEMs, and they measure them. And they find, hang on, it's not exactly what the OEM has promised. And actually the OEM also in his software, he uses all of these idealized, let's call them idealized plates. But in reality, they're actually not always like that. What I've also found in doing comparisons to the different plate libraries that are out there, a lot of them are a bit secret really, I suppose, and I've compared them, there are differences actually. And these are big names, people that you're paying $100,000 type for packages and so on. And I found differences, and I was quite amazed at that. And then I went through everything carefully and cross-checked, and there are differences, quite substantial differences. So the people in the field get very confused because they're not sure if it's right or wrong. So I've actually done all the homework on all of that, and I've been careful just to see what's going on. You're also going to find, okay, these M's and so on, these are typically modeled off a particular manufacturer, okay? But they are gasketed plates. These are gasketed plates and so on. All right. But when you get up to the top end, these are brazed plates based off another manufacturer. Okay, and they're brazed, and the response is different. What you can do with a brazed plate is a little bit different to what you can do with a gasketed plate. With a brazed plate, for instance, we don't like to go multi-pass. In other words, you kind of packing one exchanger linked to the next. The flows go backwards and forwards, up and down, up and down. We don't do that with brazed because it's quite complicated to do all the routing. So the brazed are kind of very simplified, one straight through type constructions. Whereas when we get to gasketed, they're much more complicated. We can do a lot of tricks with them. We can actually make them go a number of passes in series. Now, some do all of these kind of cross-flow type units, which is really counterproductive. Unit from a heat transfer point of view, you need to be going counterflow. Okay, when you start getting a mixture of parallel flow and counterflow, parallel flow means that both fluids flow in the same direction. Counterflow means they flow in opposite directions. And the standard, what they call counterflow correction factor, for when you're going counterflow correction is 1. When you're going for parallel flow, it's a half. So you're actually reducing the effective heat transfer by half just by routing it incorrectly. You can be very careful on your ins and outs on a plate exchanger or any exchange. You have to be very careful. So the first part here literally is brazed plates, and then after that we move typically into the gasketed plates. And there's a few, just to give you a feel for what goes on. Some plates, for instance, might only have an H plate. It only makes one type of plate. When you go back, I'm bouncing a little bit here, when you go back though to the brazed, they only have one angle. Now, what again I've also noticed in the marketplace is people trying to say, well, you've either got a 60-degree angle or a 30-degree, so H would be a 60 degrees, so 2 times 60 is 120 for the included angle, and your L plate will be a 30, in other words, 2 times 30 is 60 included angle, and your M will be somewhere in between, 45 times 2 is 90. But that's not true. When you so they're assuming this, and these are fancy packages, believe me, right, trying to get into the market. But when you actually look at the actual values, the measured values, they're not what they say. So sometimes you say 60, it's not. It's 62 or it's 63. Okay? And your bottom end might actually be, instead of 30, might be 27 or 28. And this actually affects the heat transfer and the pressure drop dramatically. And so a lot of these consensus plates have really got their stuff all mixed up. Now, why do I say this? The software that I've got here, as I say, it came all the way through from, I call the Plate Masters. And I've got a thing here which is not showing up on this model, but it's a little algorithm that you can actually input all the plate geometry, and then you can actually predict the performance of the plates. In other words, you can actually predict the heat transfer and the pressure drop. And then what you then do is you compare and you calibrate against some of the industry standard plates from the OEM, for instance, or other sources that you know. And then you can further adjust until you get the thing bang on at certain calibration points. Now, it's the only software that I know that you can actually do that. Alright, so I can fine tune. In the longer term, what we're actually going to do is actually go using machine learning and tweak a little bit further, so the algorithms will be even more accurate than they are at the moment. It'll actually save a lot of other work where I go in and I tweak them and adjust them and cross-check them and so on manually, and I actually adjust so that I get the right calculations. You must plates are very exotic things, and you're actually doing a lot with them. Typically you've got very low velocities in between in the plate channels because the pressure drops end up too high, and so we're running in what we would normally call almost a laminar range, and it's not quite really. It's running, often they run in the transition zone or slightly or lightly turbulent. So there's a lot to learn about plate exchangers. So I've kind of given a little bit of a talk through at the moment based off this batch mode and so on, and then on the pressure drop mode. But if you look through the pressure drop library here, it's actually very big. There's a lot of different plates and water, and you can play with different things. So my advice to you is you just go and click on something that's nominally close to what you want to use. It'll swing it up as a template, and then you can go and play with a few values here. It saves you a lot of heartache trying to think, what was this, what was that, what was the next thing. Alright. So that will be, this is part 2 that we're finishing off here. I'll keep it short. And then what I'll do in the next part, I'll start to actually work with plate exchanges, and then I'll go through part of that because that's single phase. There's quite a lot to absorb there. And then I'll move on later on to things like condensers and evaporators, which are quite exotic. And ironically, there's no packages out there that handle these very nicely, condensers and evaporators, because they are highly non-linear. So if you're a guy at university, you know exactly what I mean by non-linear. The heat transfer equations themselves, if you look at the log mean temperature difference, is non-linear. Alright, the stream calculations, MCP, m dot Cp delta T, those are linear. But when you get to the log mean temperature difference part, it's non-linear. So the heat transfer itself is non-linear. You know, UAF delta T log M. The whole equation is non-linear. Then when you start looking at the heat transfer coefficients themselves, they are highly non-linear. You know, they've got power terms and all kinds of things. So you're asking for a little bit of a headache sometimes, and especially when you start looking at fluid parameters that themselves are non-linear. They have curves. And so there's a lot that goes on, and the poor program has to do a lot of juggling and bouncing. It's very easy for single phase, but when you get to the condenser and evaporator, there's a little bit of trickery and a little bit of cunning actually sometimes to get it to converge to where you want to go. But it's a lot going on. Okay, it's not magic, it's just cunning. So I'll stop there for now. And so just to get out of here, you just press finish and you're done. And then I'll just clean up, so for next time, yeah, the screen recorder, sorry, it's making it a little bit slouchy, but when you actually run the program yourself without the screen recorder, it's quite quick. Alright, it's just the screen recorder seems to be grabbing and slowing things down. So what I'll do next time is I'll go on to the PHE itself, and I'll show you, you know, when you open up a screen, you'll see it's just in fact with the plate exchanger one, you'll see it's quite basic. We've got a standard example that comes up, and so for that you can just go in and play. It's quite easy just to go straight in and fast track. But for condenser and evaporator, it's better to work with the templates that I've given you under standard example. So we'll stop there for now as part 2, give you a little bit of a rundown on that, and then I'll go on to the actual plate heat exchanger single phase part next time, and we'll see how far that gets, and I might have to do that in some steps as well. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Cheers for now. Bye bye.